continuing A.J. Langguth's menagerie of one-liners, vignettes, and short stories from his novels Jesus Christ. We begin episode 3 with a one-paragraph short called The Dreamer, followed by a vignette entitled Mystery of Life, and culminating with the first of a two-part story, Jesus' Dilemma, which we conclude in the fourth and final episode of Jesus Christ. We now open with The Dreamer.
Jesus had begun to dream every night. He resented dreaming, and he refused the next morning to remember messages that had come to him, not from God, but from a part of himself that had nothing to tell him.
And from here we proceed to the vignette, Mystery of Life.
Jesus overheard the apostles speaking again of the mystery of life. The phrase annoyed him, and he demanded that they produce a list of the elements that made up that mystery. Andrew came dutifully to him the next day with a single typewritten page. What is life? Why do men live? What is love? Is love good for men or bad? Why is incest attractive? Why is incest forbidden? Have we lived before? Will we live again? Why does every man hope to fail, suffer, and die? Why does every man fight to dominate, inflict pain, and live? Jesus counted
10? Can your fabled mystery be reduced to 10 simple questions?
Simon wanted to know why certain sounds and certain sights please us and others sicken us. We thought that was one of the secondary questions that we didn't need to trouble you with. John wanted to know why he grits his teeth when he strokes his favorite cat. Those were the only things we eliminated.
Who is obsessed with incest?
Your brother, Lord. He thinks many other questions would be unnecessary if those two were answered honestly.
There's nothing personal in his interest?
Andrew kept his eyes on the list and refused to smile.
You'd have to ask him, Lord. We agreed to put in his questions because nobody wanted to have to argue against them.
Jesus folded the paper twice and slipped it into the top drawer of his desk.
From now on, when we talk about life, let us address ourselves to one of these questions. Don't you agree, Andrew? We needn't waste any more time with beautiful evasions like mystery.
Yes, Lord.
Jesus was about to return to his work when an oversight on the list struck him. He drew out the paper and read it through again.
You don't ask if there is a God.
He was delighted to see Andrew begin to blush.
We thought it wasn't a good time to raise all that. We thought if you knew, you would have told us before this.
You do me no favor, Andrew, holding back the one true question. Here.
He threw the list over the desktop. I am
I am proving that men want to be hurt. Hurt me.
At the top of the page, Andrew wrote in a haphazard scribble that made the typewritten words look false and far away. Is there a God? He pushed the list back to Jesus.
The answer to your last question, which has become your first question, is no. You'll forgive me if I don't want to plunge immediately into something so timely and vital as why a boy shouldn't ravage his mother.
Of course, Lord.
The pain Jesus was causing Andrew showed in his face.
We'll take up the rest of them again.
Jesus replaced the list in his drawer.
I may even produce a different answer to the question we have already settled.
When one doesn't satisfy a man, Lord, he searches for another. That's science.
That's hypocrisy.
Jesus turned away so Andrew would leave.
But I've not shut hypocrisy out of my life. And we may as well not trouble our friends with the answer to a question they didn't ask.
You can trust me, Lord.
The look Jesus gave him sent Andrew hurrying from the room.
With this conclusion to Mystery of Life, we introduce the first half of the story, Jesus' Dilemma.
Water in their cave had seeped to their bare feet and turned the dirt on their toes to mud. The younger men were in the midst of celebrating the rain, dancing on the soft earth to feel the splatter of mud against their ankles. They were not forgetting as they splashed that their black shirts would be wet now, day and night. But their shirts had been damp with sweat for months, and rain at least would be fresher on their backs. They were not forgetting either that the rain might ruin their ammunition and rot their food. Not forgetting these good reasons for hating the rain, they had begun to cheer when the first torrent of water came crashing out of the sky. They had clapped each other's backs and sung traditional songs of victory. They could rejoice at each burst of downpour that would leave them filthy and sick, because they knew the rain would hurt their enemies even more. The aliens had airplanes, and airplanes could not fly through the mountains in the rain.
No bombs for 3 months.
Cried James, the merriest boy in the platoon.
Don't be sure.
Peter warned.
They learned to fly at night. They could learn to fly when it rained.
No. They may own the skies, but we own the heavens. This rain from heaven is proof we will win.
You didn't tell us that during the dry month.
John spoke from a straw mat at the back of the cave.
You didn't say the sunshine proved that they were going to beat us.
Of course not, because they're going to lose. The heavens couldn't send us a false sign, could they?
He swaggered to John's side and put his pistol to his brother's head.
Could they?
John pushed the barrel aside.
You're right, brother. We're very lucky to have you to sort out the true portents for the false. Otherwise, we might come to believe that our winning depends on how bravely we fight.
Quiet.
In the absence of Jesus, Judas was the commander.
Even if the aliens stay out of the sky, they may come crawling around on foot.
Especially during the day, when they don't have to be afraid of the dark.
The week before, he had been shot in the leg during a daytime shooting foray. When the bullet was dug out of his flesh, he was left with a sore leg and a new distrust of the sun.
When we rule the country, we will conduct all business at night to please my brother.
You have always handled your business at night.
The others laughed softly at the bickering between brothers.
Don't be jealous. They shot low enough. Soon you'll be back at it yourself.
Peter asked Judas when Jesus would rejoin them. He was afraid the question would annoy the acting commander and tried to show in his manner that he was not impatient.
He didn't say.
John had watched Jesus leave 3 days before, and he told Peter.
He said he was going to get new instructions and didn't know when he will be back. He expected this week to be quiet because of the holidays.
And how are you going to celebrate?
James kicked his brother's sore leg.
Why don't you dance for us?
When I dance, it'll be on your body.
James laughed and danced a parody of John on the battlefield, cowering and cringing, dodging in every direction until at last one bullet catches the very tip of his toe. Obeying Judas, the men laughed deep in their throats. 1 hour passed, and then another. At every slight sound, the men who could sleep blinked awake. Most of them had grown up on a continual alert, and they didn't bother to think that they might be killed at any minute of the day. Older than the others, Peter had known periods of fitful peace, and the tension sometimes told on him. His patience with the clowning of the younger men would break, and during the long daylight hours, he would brood and curse their enemies. The rain stopped for several minutes. Then, as the men were attuning themselves to the silence, the downpour started again with greater force. Outside, the water hit the ground like bomb fragments and stung the face and chest of Andrew, who was standing guard on a ridge 30 feet above the cave. From his post, he could watch the road for more than a mile as it wound through the hills. At an alert from him, the cave's mouth could be barricaded and disguised until no amount of scrutiny would reveal its secret. Only the bombs could hurt them. The alien pilots might hit the hilltop accidentally, dropping with no aim, acting on nothing more than a hunch that guerrillas were camped below. Andrew had seen the first John, their former leader, buried alive in a cave, while the men who could not reach shelter had escaped. The bomber pilot had no way of knowing that he had killed their bravest man. When reports over the trader radio said the pilot claimed he had killed 40 guerrillas, the men of the First John's company did not scoff at his boast. They would have given up 40 lives, 39 others in their own, to keep the First John alive. Later that year, Andrew had cut the head off a wounded alien soldier they had captured. Judas and the other officers were going to punish him severely until he said,
For the First John.
They nodded and kept still. Andrew wanted the war to end. Like the others, he talked about the blessedness of peace and about the progress the country would make when the shooting had stopped. As he talked, he knew, too, that he didn't want the war to end before he had cut the heads off 39 more alien soldiers. The enemy had set the price. Let them pay it. Far down the hill, Andrew saw something move. After 5 hours on guard, his eyes sometimes saw more than there was to see. He shut his eyelids for a moment and looked again. Through the heavy rain, a figure was pedaling a bicycle up the road. The rider was a woman. He could see the sodden panel from her long silk dress tied to the bicycle's back bumper to keep it out of the wheel spokes. When she turned right at the next trail, it meant she was coming to the cave. Andrew gave a low whistle, hardly different from a bird's call. Judas appeared at his side.
Is it Mary Magdalene?
The sharpness of Judas's eyes was one of their legends.
She's not supposed to come. There must be trouble in town.
They watched her pedal up the hill until the mud set her tires spinning. She dismounted and hid the bicycle in the tall grass. It took her another 10 minutes to struggle the rest of the way. Out of breath, she had to try twice to repeat the sweet bird sound Andrew had made. He dropped down from his hiding place and pulled her into the cave where Judas was waiting with irritation.
Why have you come?
Her eyes were blinking from the darkness, but the men could see her clearly. She was tall, taller than their women, a little darker skinned and much braver. When the peace had collapsed, she had moved to the province capital to sleep with alien soldiers. Her earnings from the enemy bought food for the guerrillas. To get more cash, she sold in the black market all the presents the aliens gave her. The wives of some rebels said the war had given her an excuse to be the slut she had been destined to become. But they couldn't deny that she had stolen a dozen pistols for their husbands, or that she had brought medicine to the cave when they needed it. Apologetically, she said,
I have news. The 4th Trader Battalion and the 2nd Alien Battalion are joining tonight to try to destroy you.
They don't know where we are.
They are sending more than 1,000 men from here to the river. They are sure they will find you. But I have seen the plans at their headquarters. Only one alien company will pass along here, down the trail by the 5 rocks. You could surprise them and get back here before the others could relieve them.
Judas thought that one day Mary Magdalene would fall in love with an alien and, as a dowry, would betray her countrymen. Yet her information had been good so far. He listened intently.
You are now a commanding general, are you? You might wish to stay with us and lead the attack yourself, since you have planned it so carefully.
I did not mean to put myself forward.
Her meekness, which enchanted the aliens, was genuine.
It was only that as I looked at the maps, it seemed so good a plan. I can draw it in the dirt, what I saw, and you will find that what I said is nothing more than what any of your soldiers would propose.
Very well. Draw here.
With his toe, he scraped clean a square of dirt. Peter put a candle at the center, and James brought a sturdy stick with a sharp point.
Are you sure?
Judas asked as she sketched familiar landmarks.
That you saw the actual plan and not a map to mislead spies?
The alien colonel keeps it locked in his bedroom. Even the maids in the house do not have a key to the cabinet. They are against us anyway. He has bought their loyalty with money and hairspray.
She pulled ruefully at her own damp hair, hanging over her ears like seaweed. The men who were awake had gathered around her on all sides. With arrows and dotted lines, she traced for them the enemy tactics.
That's good.
Judas said when she had finished.
That's good. We can kill more than 50 of their men at little risk.
Philip tried to whisper a question to the girl, but the rain had stopped and everyone in the circle heard him.
Did you bring any chocolate?
Judas struck him in the face with a closed fist.
She has risked her life to bring us this plan. Only someone as ungrateful and stupid as you could ask such a thing.
Mary Magdalene had moved to caress the sore spot on Philip's cheek, but her pride in Judas's words made her flush.
We must begin preparing for the ambush.
Judas said to her,
You should not be gone any longer. If the aliens find you on the road, you are returning from taking holiday greetings to your family.
Yes.
Judas waved her away. When she reached the mouth of the cave, he called.
Next time, don't forget the chocolate.
He gestured impatiently to the men, and they began to wake their comrades. Since they had not fought for nearly 2 months, they knew Judas would make a ritual of the inspection. Most of the weapons had been captured from the enemy. They were heavy rifles that shot straight and killed efficiently. The men found great satisfaction in shooting an alien soldier with his own bullets. Last year, when their store of captured ammunition had run low, they had crept to the seacoast. There, from a junk disguised with fishing nets, they had picked up a supply of lighter weight weapons. Judas knew which large nation had sent the new supplies, but most of the men feared anything outside their province, and he did not tell them they were incurring foreign debts. Nathaniel had begun hauling out the electrically detonated mines. Watching him, Judas wondered, as he often did, at the inability of his men to learn anything from experience.
Those mines are for limited harassment on the days of enemy convoys.
He helped Nathaniel put them back beneath a tarpaulin.
Tonight, we will not expose our intentions by using mines. You saw the plan the horde drew. We will surround the company between the rocks and the river, and we will kill all of them within 2 minutes of the first shot we fire. We will give them no warning, and we will leave no trace for their relief forces to follow. Do you understand me?
Nathaniel nodded vigorously, too slow and good humor to detect a reproach. By the time their rifles had been oiled and their ammunition belts stocked, the rain had ended. The night, darker than the storm, was closing over the hillside. The men had 3 more hours to wait before taking up their positions, but they did not go back to sleep. They sat silently in the corners of the cave. John, who had not recovered enough to join them in the ambush, knew better than to say a word. Judas's wristwatch showed less than 1 hour until they would move out when the bird signal sounded again. He prayed it was not Jesus returning, and he was repeating that prayer when Jesus appeared beside him. Jesus nodded to the armed men and asked Judas,
Have you had any trouble?
Not yet.
Judas told him every detail of the girl's visit. But as he spoke, he felt that the commander's excitement was not keeping pace with his own. He began to prolong his account to delay an answer. When he had finished, Jesus said,
The plan is good, but we must cancel it.
they had watched enough men die for Judas to be able to ask.
Why?
Jesus felt his fingers digging into the softest skin of his palm. He must act calm and firm.
Orders.
Judas looked at the captain's shaved head, dusted lightly with bristles of black hair, and tried to decide whether to press him further. In the past, the two of them had spoken of the possibility that a ceasefire would have to be explained one day to their men. Now the holidays could be providing the excuse for politicians in remote cities to begin their negotiations. To them, as to most of the world, the war was a nuisance and embarrassment. But to the men in the cave and other men in caves and trenches throughout the country, the war was a religion to be celebrated every night of the year. Telling those men why they must stop killing was a job neither Judas nor Jesus had wanted to take on. They had agreed that when the moment came, they would be forthright with the men and confess that peace talks might lose all the territory and bargaining strength that the blood of the patriots had won for them. They would admit that in another 5 years, they might have to call upon the men to flee to the hills again and begin again to free their country. They would end by saying that they too had doubts about the wisdom of negotiating with hypocrites and traitors. They were good soldiers, and the ceasefire was in order. Now, canceling the ambush, Jesus might be acting on that order. But the shaved head suggested another reason to Judas. In peacetime, Jesus had lived contentedly as a priest in the highlands until the traitor government began to torture and kill the nation's religious leaders. Then Jesus had left his lodgings at the temple and joined the First John in his fight for justice. Clever and brave, Jesus had risen quickly through the ranks, but he kept his head shaved, and no one forgot that he had been a priest before he became a soldier. Only once had Judas argued with his commander. It was not long after he had been sent to the company Jesus led. More truthfully, as Judas recalled it now, he had argued alone. Jesus had heard out his shouting and then overruled him. The issue had been 2 wounded alien soldiers that they had captured after a long battle. They could not care for the prisoners, and Judas had pulled his pistol, prepared to shoot them. Jesus stopped him. His God forbade him such cruelty, he said. Judas did not share that God, but as a soldier, he was bound to obey Jesus. The wounded men were treated and set free. That was when Judas understood what pain the war was causing the priest. Afterward, he shuddered each time Jesus shot an alien, and he looked for ways to comfort him when the fighting was over. If these orders Jesus now brought were from his God, Judas would not quarrel with them. Already the war was a long one. They would have 100, 1,000 more chances to kill aliens. He cast about for a way to show Jesus that, though he did not believe, he could respect the priest's faith. He wanted to convey his loyalty without forcing Jesus to admit that the orders had not come from the province headquarters. Rehearsing his words, Judas sat silently and thought, I am speaking to him in my head, and he can sit beside me and not know what I am telling him. How strange that a slimy thing like a tongue should be the way to go from my head into his.
There is no one else I want to follow.
As Judas spoke, he felt his tongue flick against the roof of his mouth.
I would trust you to interpret our orders no matter how they came to you.
Knowing the kindness that led him to speak, Jesus almost let his gratitude betray him. He was about to say, relieve me of my command. But he caught himself and said,
Thank you.
As they waited, his doubts once more began to work on Jesus. He had not heard from an officer at their headquarters, nor had he heard instructions from his God. Crouched in tall grass, waiting and praying, he had heard from something in his muscle and flesh that said, no more killing. That was when he should have run away. He could have disappeared into another town or joined the horde of refugees on the road. He had meant to walk away from his troops and vanish from their lives, but he had to come back to them with a lie. Returning to the cave along the hidden paths, Jesus had practiced his argument with Judas.
I have been alone for 3 days,
He would begin.
and I know we must not fight anymore.
If your God forbids it, you should not join us.
Judas would answer.
He has come to see the justice of our cause before, and he will release you to us again.
My conviction does not come from my God. He has not spoken to me for many months.
Then without regret you can join us in the cause of freedom.
I am telling you that we must not kill. We must lay down our arms.
When our land is overrun by aliens who would enslave us, one course lies open to honorable men. If our leader, or if your God, directs us to stop our struggle, I will obey. But any other voice with the same order is the voice of cowardice and treachery, and I will never surrender.
Jesus knew their argument would have been longer and finally harsher than he was imagining it. Judas could repeat each of the brave old words eloquently, and he believed the words as he spoke them. In their argument, Jesus could not speak with that same conviction, for Jesus knew he was wrong. God had not told him to lay down his arms. God watched the aliens murdering farmers, setting fire to the rice crop, torturing prisoners to make them betray their countrymen. God watched, and if he was God, he would not ask godly men to let an alien plague destroy their land. But if there was no God, then Jesus would have to listen to his own soft instincts, to the numbness that crept across his body, saying, "No more killing." Jesus said to himself, "I am wrong. That I had to lie proves it." Anyone can laugh at the fine words Judas likes to speak, but they are fine because they are true. Yet my body says, "No more killing." I have seldom listened to my body, but I cannot ignore it now. Judas said,
We will take the men out anyway. There would be too much danger for the wounded if we stay here. We will follow the same route if you approve, but we will not open fire unless they engage us.
We are not to fire at all.
Surely your instructions don't forbid self-defense.
After a pause, Jesus said,
No.
There should be no need for shooting.
Judas's excitement was rising in him again like mercury.
We will be well concealed and they will march through the site without detecting us.
Good.
I would suggest one thing.
Judas was sure that the nearness of the aliens would overcome Jesus's scruples and that the ambush could proceed. If later it turned out that the orders had actually come from their headquarters, some excuse could be made. Violations were an expected counterpoint to a ceasefire.
What do you suggest?
If you would take a command spot at the top of the West Ridge, you could survey the valley. At any change in the aliens' plans, you could alert us with 2 shots when they have passed you. We would then spread out and let them chase a few men to the river. The rest could pick up the wounded and move to the old cave.
2 shots, Judas thought, and we will have our battle. You will find that a commander gives his best orders with his trigger finger.
And just how or will Jesus' dilemma be resolved? Be here for the 4th and final episode of these samplings from A.J. Langguth's novel, Jesus Christ.